Hello, my name is John Knox. I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and it's my pleasure to be with you here today to deliver the Bedrock Lecture on Climate Change and Human Rights. So when we talk about human rights, we often start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of the Human Rights Commission, the United Nations body that drafted it, and the General Assembly that adopted it in 1948 went on to draft human rights treaties based on the Universal Declaration. So in that way, it's the seminal document in all of international human rights law. The Universal Declaration includes civil and political rights, such as rights to life, liberty, security of person, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and so forth. It also includes economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to an adequate standard of living and the right to the highest attainable standard of health. What it doesn't refer to is the environment. If you look at the Universal Declaration, nowhere will you find any reference to the environment or environmental concerns. That's not because the drafters of the Declaration considered the environment and decided not to include it. It's because the modern environmental movement really didn't arise until the late 1960s, 20 years after the Universal Declaration was adopted. After the modern environmental movement did arise, there was a movement in many countries around the world, which continues to this day, to recognize the importance of environmental protection by incorporating a constitutional right to a healthy environment in their national constitution. In fact, more than 100 countries around the world now recognize that right in their national constitution. But at the international level, at the United Nations level, there wasn't this kind of recognition of a human right to a healthy environment. Instead, what happened beginning in the 1990s was that advocates such as Kumi Naidoo, then the executive director of Greenpeace International, and many other human rights and environmental bodies brought human rights issues and environmental issues together. They applied human rights law to environmental protection, and they brought environmental claims to human rights tribunals. For example, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in San Jose, Costa Rica, which has jurisdiction to hear and decide on human rights claims throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, began to decide environmental cases. So did the European Court of Human Rights and many other regional tribunals. As well, United Nations independent expert bodies, such as special rapporteurs reporting to the Human Rights Commission and Council, and treaty bodies appointed to oversee compliance with human rights treaties, they all began to hear more and more environmental cases. What these cases had in common is that they were based on existing human rights, not on a standalone human right to a healthy environment, but instead rights like the rights to life and health and an adequate standard of living, food, water, housing, and so forth. And so over time, these human rights bodies began to green human rights and create a body of environmental human rights law. In 2012, the Human Rights Council, which had taken the place of the Human Rights Commission and become the main United Nations human rights body, the Human Rights Council decided to appoint a new independent expert to examine this relationship of human rights and the environment. I had the honor of being appointed to be the first independent expert in 2012, 6 years ago. The resolution creating the mandate specifically asked me to study the human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And to that end, I undertook consultations all over the world. I did, with a great deal of help from lawyers and academics, I did research to pull together what human rights bodies had said about environmental protection. And I came to some basic conclusions. Despite the range of different rights that were interpreting them, they reached very similar conclusions. First, they all agreed that environmental harm interferes with a vast range of human rights. Second, they agreed that human rights law sets out certain basic procedural requirements that have to be followed in environmental decision-making and more generally in decision-making that has environmental effects. Third, they said that human rights law sets out minimum substantive standards. Now, while states have more discretion with respect to substantive standards than they do with procedural obligations, that discretion is not unlimited. Fourth, states have to take additional steps to protect those who are most vulnerable. So how does all this apply to climate change? Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland and the former High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations, has said that climate change is the greatest threat to human rights in the 21st century. What does she mean by that? Well, as William Gibson, the science fiction author, said, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. That is, the effects that in many countries we're still waiting to see from climate change, or we're just beginning to see as a result of climate change. In other countries, they're already here. They're already affecting life in those countries. This map shows the vulnerability index as of a couple of years ago, although it hasn't changed significantly since then. And what you see there is that the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change's effects are those in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and other hotspots around the world. What you also see is that those countries are the countries that have done the least to contribute to climate change. They're the most vulnerable despite the fact that they're the least to blame. They're the most vulnerable for many reasons, including that they may be more subject to droughts and extreme weather events. But one of the major reasons is that climate change is going to cause rising sea levels. There's really no doubt about this. It's just a matter of physics. As the climate warms, so does the ocean. And as the ocean warms, it expands. And of course, as frozen water in Greenland and Antarctica melts, it joins the ocean waters, further causing them to expand. So while predictions still vary quite a bit, it seems clear that we're looking at least a rise of a meter by 2100. Well, a rise of a meter will have really severe effects for many countries around the world, and again is already starting to have those effects. This is a map showing how much 1 meter rise in sea level, what effect that would have in the country of Bangladesh, which has extremely low-lying coastal areas. This is a picture of Malé, the island that's the capital of the Maldives, one of the lowest countries in the world. As you can see there, there's simply nowhere for the people in that country to go. There's no higher ground. A rise in sea level of 1 meter would make many of the islands of the Maldives effectively uninhabitable. So one effect of thinking about climate change through a human rights lens is to realize and put a human face on the effects of climate change, so that we're no longer thinking about just future generations or polar bears on ice floes, but we're thinking about the effects on people today, such as the Maldivian children who well may have to evacuate their home country during their own lifetime, and not that far away in their own lifetime. So how do these major human rights obligations apply in the context of climate change? In my most recent report to the United Nations Human Rights Council, I presented 16 framework principles on human rights and the environment that try to summarize the main human rights obligations that are relevant to environmental protection. Perhaps the key insight I've come to in my work as the United Nations Special Rapporteur is that human rights and the environment are really interdependent. States have to ensure a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in order to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, and vice versa. It's necessary to be able to exercise human rights in order to be able to protect the environment. More specifically, it's necessary to be able to exercise procedural rights, for example, such as rights to have states assess environmental impacts, rights to have states make environmental information public, to facilitate participation in environmental decision-making. Absolutely, the rights of freedom of expression and association are of fundamental importance in ensuring that environmental policy reflects the views of those who are most directly affected. And states have obligations under human rights law to provide effective remedies for violations of all of these rights. As I said, states also have substantive obligations. While states have somewhat more discretion here, no one expects Ghana, say, to have exactly the same level of environmental protection as Denmark, for example. Nevertheless, human rights bodies have made clear that states do have obligations to protect against, or at least to take steps to do their best to protect against foreseeable environmental harm. While they have some discretion to strike a balance between environmental protection and economic development, that balance can't be unreasonable or result in unjustified, foreseeable infringements of human rights. In particular, states should take into account international standards, such as those promulgated by the World Health Organization. They should never take retrogressive measures. They should never go backwards in their level of protection. They must never discriminate between groups. It's no excuse to say, well, we're in a state of economic development here. That's not an excuse for saying that it's okay to discriminate against a minority within that country. And once the balance is struck, states have to enforce it. They have to make sure that it's actually implemented. In addition, states have obligations to protect against threats to the most vulnerable. Those who are most vulnerable from environmental harm and climate change include, for example, women, children, the older persons, persons living in poverty, indigenous peoples, and other communities that are particularly closely reliant on the natural ecosystems which support all human life. So how do these general norms apply to climate change? Let me just highlight 3 levels: the international level, the national level, and the project level. At the international level, states have to cooperate with one another to reduce total greenhouse gas emissions. At the national level, every state has obligations to take effective adaptation measures. That is, to take measures to ensure that their people within their jurisdiction that are their responsibility have the best chance they can to adapt successfully to the unavoidable and unavoided effects of climate change. And at the project level, even projects that are designed to mitigate or adapt to climate change, they themselves have to be sure to comply with human rights obligations. So let's say a word or two more about each of those levels of obligation. At the international level, states have to cooperate to adopt mitigation necessary to reduce global emissions so as to hold the increase in global average temperature below levels that would cause widespread harm to the enjoyment of human rights. In practice, what we know from scientists that study this is that that means it's necessary to keep the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius. That means that states have a duty to cooperate to face this global shared threat. This duty to cooperate is recognized by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change itself, which recognizes that the global nature of climate change calls for the widest possible cooperation by all countries and their participation in an effective and appropriate international response. But it's also a principle of international human rights law, recognized in the Charter of the United Nations and in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So how are states doing in fulfilling this duty to cooperate? Well, it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, they have agreed to the Paris Agreement in December of 2015, Article 2 of which says that the agreement aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change, including by holding the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, that's good. However, the United Nations Environment Program has pointed out in its emissions gap report that even if fully implemented, the unconditional intended nationally determined contributions, that is the contributions that states so far have made to fulfill their commitments under the Paris Agreement, those contributions are only consistent with staying below an increase in temperature of about 3 degrees Celsius by 2100. So even if those commitments are implemented, we're only about half the way to the level that human rights standards and states themselves have recognized are necessary to avoid massive harm to humans. In my report to the Human Rights Council in March 2016, 2 years ago, I focused on human rights and climate change, and I evaluated the Paris Agreement. And I said that even if they meet their current commitments, states won't satisfy their human rights obligations. From a human rights perspective, then, I said, it's necessary not only to implement the current intended contributions, but also to strengthen those contributions in order to meet the target as set out in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. Now, what about the adaptation requirements? even a 1.5 or 2 degree increase will result, and is already resulting, in harm to the human rights of communities that are most vulnerable to climate change. States also have obligations to adopt effective adaptation measures to protect against this harm and to provide for remedies to it. I want to make clear that these adaptation measures apply to all states. Obviously, states that contribute more to the problem have greater responsibility to do something about it. There's no doubt about that. But adaptation places an obligation on all states to do what they can. So to go back to the Maldives here, the Maldives contributes virtually nothing to climate change. This is not a problem that the Maldives or other small island states or other particularly vulnerable states did anything to create. However, even the Maldives recognizes that it has to do what it can to protect its own people from climate change's effects. So in this picture, you can see the Maldives has already started to build, or already has built, a seawall around Male, its main capital, and is taking additional steps to try and protect its people from the effects of climate change. That's completely appropriate and in line with their obligations under human rights law. Other states, though, in a position to help, need to do so. The states in particular that have contributed most to the problem also need to live up to their commitments to help countries that are most at risk and most threatened by climate change. What about actions taken in response to climate change? As I said, even actions taken to respond to climate change need to make sure that they take into account human rights obligations. So the preamble of the Paris Agreement actually recognizes this. It says that parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, including these specific human rights. That's particularly important, for example, in projects that are designed to promulgate renewable energy. There have been some very strong criticisms of projects that were presented as addressing climate change by, for example, increasing hydroelectric power. But some of these projects have also been accused of massive human rights violations by running roughshod over the rights of people who already live in those areas and who are being displaced without consultation or consent in many cases. It's no excuse to say that, well, this is an important project we're working on, therefore we can ignore the human rights of those who are most affected. That's not how human rights law works, obviously. Climate finance mechanisms need to include safeguards to make sure that the hundreds of millions of dollars that are expected to flow through these mechanisms in coming years actually do protect human rights of those who are most affected. The Adaptation Fund, to mention one of these mechanisms, actually does include fairly good safeguards that protect human rights and environmental concerns. The Clean Development Mechanism, created by the Kyoto Protocol, does not. It includes almost no safeguards like this. As we move forward with the Green Climate Fund and the Sustainable Development Mechanism, it's very important to ensure that those mechanisms do include solid protective safeguards. I actually wrote a letter to a climate commission, the SBSTA, 2 years ago, setting out what the Sustainable Development Mechanism, the replacement for the Clean Development Mechanism, should include. It should include environmental and social assessment for every proposed project and program. It should provide for effective public participation in all decision making. It should provide grievance mechanisms so that those who claim that their rights have been violated can take those grievances to a body that has the authority to receive them. And of course, it should protect the most vulnerable, including indigenous peoples. Finally, I just want to mention that increasingly there are climate cases that are being brought on the basis of human rights. I won't go through all of them, but some of the most important ones in recent years include the Ashgar Laghari case in Pakistan, the Urgenda Foundation case in the Netherlands, the Earth Justice petition to the Philippines National Human Rights Institution, and in the United States, the Our Children's Trust litigation. The Philippines Human Rights Commission case involves a human rights complaint brought against several dozen so-called carbon majors, large businesses that have over the years contributed an immense amount of carbon pollution. It's actually, on the day I'm recording this, March 28th, it's on the second day of hearings in the process of hearing this complaint and hopefully issuing a decision on it later this year. The Our Children's Trust lawsuit brought in the United States is also expected to go to trial later this year. And just 2 weeks ago, a new lawsuit brought on behalf of children against another government, the government of Colombia, was filed. It also accuses its government of not doing enough to safeguard human rights by not doing enough to protect against the effects of climate change. So that concludes my Bedrock lecture on climate change and human rights. For more information about this, I encourage you to go to my website. It has an impossibly long name, but if you Google OHCHR for Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Knox, then it will take you to a website that has many more reports, including my report on climate change and human rights. And I hope that you find that useful. Thank you very much.